Hi guys, in today's lens review, I'm going to be reviewing this. This is the Canon RF 14 to 35mm f4L IS USM lens. And I'm going to start right now. Announced back in August 2021, this lens here is one of Canon's widest ultra-wide angle zoom lenses with an amazing focal range of 14 to 35mm. In fact, it's actually the widest Canon RF lens with a standard filter thread. So if you want to use a polarizing filter or neutral density filter, I actually think this lens is going to be ideal for landscape photographers. But is it any good? And is it worth buying over the more popular 15 to 35mm f2.8? Let's find out in today's lens review. So let's talk about the overall build quality, lens design, as well as what you get inside the box. Now this lens here is made of a premium plastic and metal construction, which makes it very similar to other Canon RF L series lenses. If you've ever owned the 15 to 35mm or the 24 to 70 or 7200, the build quality is pretty much identical. Now this lens has got 16 elements in 12 groups, which makes it fairly average for an ultra wide angle zoom lens. And very similar to the other L series lenses, this lens also has weather sealing built in, which I think is a great positive and ideal if you're a landscape photographer. Now on the side of the lens, you've got two switches. You've got an autofocus to manual focus switch, and then you've also got an image stabilization switch. And we'll both talk about IS and AF later on in this video. And then just above that, you've got a zoom ring. And this is where this lens is a little bit peculiar, especially when you compare it to the older EF 16 to 35mm f4. And that is because it's an externally zooming lens. But not only that, it kind of gets longer and shorter depending on where you are in the zoom range. So at 14mm, it's quite long, and then it kind of gets shorter around 24mm, and then it extends again at 35mm. And that's kind of the biggest gripe I've got with this lens. If this lens was internally zoomed, I think it would be an ideal landscape lens. But because it's got kind of this gap in the top, depending on where you are in the zoom range, moisture, water, and even dust could easily get within this gap. And I think that's the same problem I've got with the 15 to 35mm. If they were completely internally zoomed lens, I think they'd be perfect. But because of this gap here, you might end up getting dust and debris in it, and it might cause problems later down the line. I've only had this for a week, so maybe in a 3-year review, I might notice a little bit more of, or might give you a bit more of an opinion on the overall build quality, but this gap here, I'm not a massive fan. And just above that, you've also got a tiny focus ring, and it's a little bit too small even for a lens of this size. I wish it was just a little bit bigger, but to be honest with you, you never really need to use it because of how good the autofocus is in this lens. But again, we'll talk about autofocus in a bit. And then right at the top here, you've got a control ring. And if you've ever used a Canon RF lens before, it's pretty much the same. It lets you change certain custom functions with inside your camera, like shutter speed, aperture, ISO. I have actually mine, because I'm a wedding photographer, connected to white balance, which means when I go from an inside environment to an outside environment, I can actually change my white balance accordingly, really easily, just simply sliding the control ring. This one's clickable, but if you wanted it to be de-clicked, you can send it off to Canon for a price. So what do you get inside the box? Well, you obviously get the lens itself, you get a front and rear lens cap, and possibly the most pointless lens hood you've ever seen. It is so small, it offers basically no protection to the front element, as well as flaring reduction is pretty much non-existent. I tried it with and without a lens hood to see if there's any difference in flaring, and to be honest with you, I just couldn't see a difference. So although it comes with a lens hood, I don't think it offers you any flaring reduction or any protection. So use it if you want to, or otherwise just keep it in the box. And then also in the box, you also get a lens pouch as well. And for the price of the lens, it's a bit of a disappointing lens pouch. It's just the standard lens pouch you get with any Canon RF lens. It offers no protection, it's just this felt material with kind of like a fake leather bottom to it. If you want actual protection, you're probably gonna have to buy an additional lens pouch, or just buy one of the secondhand Sigma ones. That's what I do. It offers a really nice zipper on the top and a little bit of padding. But yeah, to be honest with you, the accessories I'd probably just keep in the box. Although I suppose it might be handy to have this lens hood, but yeah, I noticed no difference in flaring or protection, so bit of a pointless lens hood that. But overall, I actually think the build quality of this lens is really good. The only downside I can really see is it's externally zooming, which I'm sure water and moisture or dust can get in there, but they are offering weather sealing, which I actually think is really good, especially if you're a landscape photographer. I just wish it was an internally zooming lens. It only extends a little bit, so why don't they just make it a little bit bigger? But I suppose it does make this lens smaller and lighter when it goes in your bag, which we'll talk about in a bit. But overall, the build quality I think is really good, but not quite as good as other lenses on the market. So because of that, I'm only going to be giving it a solid 9 out of 10. Now, when buying a lens with a red ring, you should be getting great image quality. So let's see if this lens really lives up to the hype of the red ring, especially when you compare it to the more expensive 15 to 35mm f2.8. Now, I took this lens to a wedding and actually really like ultra wide angle zoom lenses for wedding photography. They're great for environmental portraits at 35mm. They're great at group portraits all the way from 14 to 35mm, as well as landscape photos. If you want to integrate the venue more into your photos, as an ultra wide angle zoom lens is going to be great for that, as well as more intimate and smaller wedding venues. It makes the wedding venue look bigger because you're shooting more wide angle, which I think I really like. Now actually, I really liked a lot of the photos from this wedding, and they were all shot with the 14 to 35mm. I really liked its versatile nature from 14mm, which is really wide, to 35mm, which is more standard wide, which is more of my favourite type of focal length for wedding photography. But is it sharp? Let's have a look at a few graph images. So wide open at 14mm, we go ahead and zoom in. We can see that the center is incredibly sharp, wide open at f4, but the corners, a little bit of a different story. There's a decent amount of distortion involved, there's a little bit of vignetting, the images are definitely darker, as well as there is a little bit softer, there's a little bit less contrast, and overall sharpness isn't as good as the center. Now we can improve that by stepping down to f5.6, and then f8, and then f11, these corners are very, very good, I would say. They're nice and sharp, although they are still a little bit distorted, and definitely there's still vignetting in the corners. And then if we step down to f16, that's where this lens is starting to suffer from diffraction, and then at its narrowest aperture, f22, we can see at 14mm, the overall image is noticeably softer versus f8. Then let's go ahead and zoom into 35mm. So back wide open again at f4, we can see that the center and the corners are a little bit more consistent here. The overall sharpness is definitely more improved upon at especially wide open at 14mm. Then if we go ahead to f5.6, we can see that the corners and the center improve again, and it's the same situation with f8. I think if you want to get the best out of this lens, I'd recommend shooting at f8 all the way through its zoom range. Then at f11, they notice it gets a little bit softer, and again that's a little bit more noticeable at f16 and very noticeable at its narrowest aperture of f22. So let's jump over to distortion and vignetting, and well, firstly, you can't actually turn off profile corrections off in camera, you have to do it in Photoshop or Lightroom, and blimey, you can see why. An extreme amount of distortion and vignetting wide open at 14mm. Now we can push that vignetting to the corners in f5.6 and then at f8, but it doesn't get much better than that. There'll always be vignetting in this lens, and the distortion is very extreme at 14mm, but it's 14mm, what can you expect? Then if we jump to 35mm, as you can see, the profile is a lot flatter. There's less distortion. There's still a small amount of pinkish distortion, but there's definitely less noticeable than at 14mm. Then if we can push those vignettings to the corner at f5.6, but again, doesn't really seem to disappear, doesn't matter what aperture you shoot it at. So, highly recommend using profile corrections. In fact, you can't actually turn it off in camera. So now let's have a look at the overall macro ability of this lens, and actually it's really impressive, with a minimum focus distance of just 20 centimeters with a maximum reproduction ratio of 0.38. Now if we go have a look at a photo wide open at f4, if we go ahead and zoom in, you'll notice this lens is actually quite soft at its minimum focus distance, but definitely improves at f5.6 and then they're really sharp at f8. So although it's got a really good minimum focus distance, the image quality wide open isn't very good, so highly recommend stepping down to either f5.6 to f8 to get the best sharpness, minimum focus distance with this lens. And lastly, let's have a look at flaring, and wow, this is a really impressive score for this lens. This lens here has amazing flaring, very little flaring and really good contrast even when pointing it at bright lights. And the sun stars on this lens are also really good as well. You can actually get a sun star wide open at f4, which I don't understand how that's even possible, but to get the best sun stars with this lens, I recommend shooting between f8 to f11, but flaring on this lens is one of the best I've seen from an ultra wide angle zoom lens. So overall, I actually think the image quality is really good with this lens. The downside to it is that distortion and vignetting wide open at 14mm. And the reason I think the images are softer in the corners is because profile corrections are distorting the corners to make it look flat. Because you can't turn off peripheral illumination and distortion in camera, if you go ahead and do it in Photoshop or Lightroom, you can really see the difference. It kind of crops in and really distorts the images. So that's why the images are soft in the corners. So although this lens has got really good center sharpness, I recommend stepping down to get the best image quality. And when you do step down, you're getting really good flaring and amazing sun stars. This is probably the best landscape lens I've ever used. So if you're a landscape photographer, highly recommend buying this lens. So because of that, I'm going to be giving it not the highest score, because I definitely think you can improve on this lens. I'm going to be giving it a solid 9 out of 10. Now, when looking at the Canon RF lineup and you want to buy an ultra wide angle zoom lens, you've realistically got two options. You've got the 14 to 35mm f4 and the 15 to 35mm f2.8. And the big reason to buy the 14 to 35mm over the 15 to 35mm is the size and weight. This lens here is far smaller and far lighter. But let's compare it to a few other lenses on the market to really see, is this lens the best lens for you if size and weight is a really important factor. So firstly, let's have a look at the 14 to 35mm first. This lens here only comes in at 540 grams. And if we have a look at the size chart here versus the other lens we're comparing it to today, we can see it's the smallest and lightest on our list. Then we can compare it to the more popular 15 to 35mm f2.8. That lens there comes in at 840 grams. Then we can compare it to the predecessor to this lens here, the 16 to 35mm EF f4 IS. That lens there comes in at 615 grams. And then lastly, the EF 16 to 35mm f2.8 Mark III, and that lens there comes in at 790 grams. And this is the widest angle out of the bunch with the most versatile focal range from 14 to 35mm, where the rest of the lenses are either 15 or 16mm. And it might not seem like a big difference, but actually the difference between 14 and 16mm is pretty significant. Here's 16mm and here's 14mm. And because this lens has got a standard filter thread of 77mm, it's the widest angle lens you can buy with a standard filter thread, which again, really impressive, and especially if you're a landscape photographer. So actually, hands down, this is the best lens you can buy when it comes to size and weight. So because of that, I'm gonna give it the full marks, the 10 out of 10. So next up, let's have a look at the overall autofocus, image stabilization, and what this lens was like for video, especially if you're a hybrid shooter. So let's talk about the autofocus first. Instantaneous. The fastest autofocus I have ever used. It is incredibly snappy. It's almost like magic. Now, I was using the Canon R5, so it may be different depending on what camera you're using it with, but one of the fastest autofocus systems I've ever used. I think it's faster than the f2.8, and I think that's just to do with the smaller elements because it's only f4 versus f2.8. I think they probably have the same autofocus system, and because the elements are smaller, it's less inertia and it can move it faster. But yeah, unbelievably fast autofocus and very reliable. It doesn't matter what aperture you shoot it at. Image stabilization was also really good as well. Wide open at 14mm has a little bit of a peculiar warping issue, but it's only noticeable when you're walking or running or doing any fast movement with image stabilization turned on. So it offers up to 5 stops built into the lens itself, and it offers an additional 2 stops if you couple it with IBIS camera, which is in-body image stabilization. So I was using the R5, but if you had maybe the R3, R6 Mark II, something like that, with IBIS built in, you get up to 7 stops, which is really impressive, which means you'll be able to do handheld photos for around about 2 seconds and still get great sharp images. So I went to Kew Gardens, and all of these shots here are using with the lens IBIS turned on. They're really smooth, and you can pretty much use this lens without a gimbal when you use a camera with image stabilization. Really impressive autofocus and really impressive image stabilization. I was genuinely surprised of how good this lens was. I think it's one of the best lenses you can buy when it comes to autofocus and image stabilization. Great if you're a hybrid shooter and someone that does a lot of hybrid work. This is definitely on my list to possibly buy in the next few months. Really good lens. So because of that, I'm giving it the full marks, the 10 out of 10. And lastly, let's talk about price. And this is where this lens, I wouldn't say lets itself down, but the pricing of this lens versus other lenses is a little bit peculiar, and let me explain. So this lens here comes in brand new at £1,599, and second hand, if we have a look at the MPB website, we can see that you can get it for around £1,300 to £1,500. And for what you're getting, I think that's fairly reasonably priced, but this is where it gets a little bit complicated. Let's compare it to the RF 15 to 35mm f2.8. That lens there comes in at £2,399, and second hand, you'll be able to find it between £1,700 to £1,900. And that's the problem with this lens. I think it's too closely priced to the f2.8. Brand new, there's only £800 difference, but second hand, depending on where you buy it from, you could theoretically buy it at the same price as the f2.8, and why would you buy the f4 and the f2.8? Why are they the same price? They're very different lenses. The f2.8 should be more expensive. This should be significantly cheaper than it actually is. And that's the peculiar thing. I don't know why this lens is so expensive. Taking it out of context, I think this is a fairly well-priced lens, but when you put it in context with the rest of the lenses, it's too expensive for what it is. I just don't understand that. Now let's compare it to a few older lenses. Let's compare it to the Canon EF 16 to 35mm f4 IS. That lens there comes in at £1,599, the same price as this. So if you've got a mirrorless camera, buy this lens over the older EF version, no brainer, same price, brand new. But second hand, because it's so much older, you'll be able to find it between £400 to £600 in good condition. So if you are on a budget, that lens is really good and significantly cheaper than this, simply to do with the age of the lens. But don't forget, you'll need to buy that EF to RF adapter as well. And the last lens we compare it to is the Canon EF 16 to 35mm f2.8 Mark III. Brand new, that comes in a ridiculous £2,389, but because it's significantly older now and it's an EF lens, that only comes in between £800 to £1,000. Again, don't forget, you need to buy an EF to RF adapter because that is a DSLR lens. So yeah, bit disappointed of how expensive this lens is. For what you get, I actually think it's not too bad value for money, but it's so closely priced to the f2.8, you might as well buy that lens, and it kind of prices itself out of its own ecosystem. I think it needs to be about £400 cheaper, at least £1,000 different to the f2.8 to actually make it kind of value for money. Otherwise, I just think you might as well buy the f2.8 if they're so closely related. And the only reason I would buy this lens over the f2.8 if they are similarly priced is the size and weight aspect. And for me, that's not really that important when you look at aperture. So it's such a shame that it's so expensive versus the f2.8. I wish it was cheaper. So because of that, I'm only going to be giving it a 4 out of 10. Reasonably priced, but too expensive in my opinion. Right, so it's that part of the video again where we look at the overall pros and cons to really work out, is this lens worth a spot in your camera bag? Let's have a look at the pros first. So first up, you're getting great build quality. Weather sealing on an ultra wide angle zoom lens is really helpful, especially if you're a landscape photographer. You're also getting great image quality with an amazing minimum focus distance of 20 centimeters. The image quality is really impressive with this lens. You're also getting super fast autofocus, almost instantaneous, and it's genuinely like using a magical lens. You're also getting great and reliable image stabilization. So if you're a video shooter, you're after a great hybrid lens, this lens is ideal. It's also smaller and lighter than the f2.8 equivalent. So if you're a landscape photographer and size and weight is a really big factor when buying a lens, this lens here is going to be perfect for you. And lastly, it's the widest angle lens you can buy with a standard filter thread. Great if you want to use filters like NDs or polarizers on your next shoot. So as you can see, a great amount of pros, but there are a few cons that we need to talk about to really round this review off. Firstly, it's got bad distortion and vignetting. In fact, so bad, you can't turn it off in camera, which is never a good sign. And because of that distortion and vignetting, it does squish and distort those corners, making them naturally a little bit softer. So if you're after better corner image sharpness, I'd probably recommend the 15 to 35mm, as it performed a little bit better in my tests. And lastly, this lens is too closely priced to the 15 to 35mm f2.8 to offer great value for money. Sure, I don't think it's too badly priced, but I still think it needs to be about £200 to £400 cheaper to actually make it beneficial to buy this lens over the more expensive f2.8. So after using this lens for a week, do I recommend it? Yes, I actually think this is probably one of the best lenses I have used. I love an ultra wide angle, so I'm a little bit biased, but this lens here, actually, I was really surprised with. It's smaller, it's lighter, and it's less expensive than the f2.8, or offering many of the benefits of an f2.8. It's got a great autofocus, great image stabilization, and actually, the image quality is so close to the f2.8, it's very difficult to determine the difference. So if you are wondering, what should I buy, the 14 to 35mm f4 or the 15 to 35mm f2.8? I think it comes down to one factor: low light. If you need a lens that's got great low light performance, then the f2.8 is going to naturally be a better lens for you. But I think for everybody else, if low light isn't a major factor when it comes to your types of photography, maybe you're a landscape photographer and always shooting on a tripod, maybe you're an architecture photographer always shooting in the daytime, or maybe a real estate photographer and low light, you just have a flash, then just simply use this lens here. It offers basically all the benefits of the f2.8 when it comes to image quality, autofocus, image stabilization, while being smaller, lighter, and cheaper. And it just makes more sense. I genuinely think this is one of the best lenses. The two things I think kind of let itself down is the corner image sharpness and how closely priced it is to the f2.8, which is why I think it's more popular. The f2.8 is more popular because this lens here is so closely priced. A lot of people just think, oh, I'm just gonna upgrade to the f2.8, but actually, I don't think you need to. So unless you need that extra stop of light, the 14 to 35mm, in my opinion, makes more sense to buy. And with an overall score of 42 out of 50, this is a highly recommended lens to have in your camera bag. But of course, write down in the comments below, which out of these two lenses, what one would you buy? The 14 to 35mm or the 15 to 35mm? Make sure to write it down in the comments below. I've been James for Photo Fever, and I'll catch you guys next time.